Hi, I'm Kim Janson, and I'm here to talk to you about talent management. It's really actually one of my favorite things to talk about because intuitively it makes tremendous sense for organizations to think about the people and the skill sets and how to enable business strategy. I'm going to talk to you for a number of minutes to help you understand both the opportunities and sometimes the missed opportunities around talent management. Let me get started with a quick background of who I am and why I have such opinions. So the first part is my background. I was the Chief Talent Officer at Heinz for 5 years. I worked for Bank of America and was the Senior Vice President of Leadership Development for Brian Moynihan. Brian Moynihan is currently the CEO of Bank of America. Prior to that, I was at Hasbro for 10 years, and I headed up learning, leadership development, organizational effectiveness, and diversity, all worldwide. And prior to that, I worked for Bank of Boston and Bank Boston Mortgage Corporation. I currently have my own business. It's called Janson Associates, and I help organizations, teams, people really unleash their potential by providing either direct solutions or working to help transform organizations or providing programs support as well. I just published a book. It's called Demystifying Talent Management, and it's being really well received, and I coach and teach at the Harvard Business School as well. The opinions around talent management were formed based on 20 years in large organizations, all Fortune 500, some either Fortune 200 or 100 as well. I have worked in over 40 countries. I've traveled extensively, and I find that a lot of these issues are pervasive in developed markets, emerging markets, regardless of the continent I'm on. There's some central tenets that get muddled and confused around talent management. So let's start with what we're talking about. I'm not someone who's pretty formulaic and has to adhere to a lot of models. I'm someone who has found power through simplicity and helping people intuitively understand why they want to do some things. So let's start with the concept of business strategy. So your organization or your team or whatever you're working with has as its goal to accomplish certain things this year and certain things longer term. We're going to talk about that in terms of either business strategy, so 12 months or longer, or an operating plan, 12 months or less. And in order to actually accomplish that, you need the people to do the work and to have the capabilities to do that. So it makes sense that your talent solution is in direct correlation to your business needs. And that's the first place to start. So managing and developing talent isn't a nice thing to do. It doesn't happen because you're a good person. It happens because it's a strategic business imperative that in reality, how else are you supposed to ensure that not only you can meet this year's goals, but longer term as well? If you use that as the backdrop, then it would make perfect sense that people would spend time in this way. But unfortunately, that's not the case, and we know that. What is important to know is organizations do want to win. And people want to be successful, but so many things get in the way. So let's get after that. If you think in terms of who the most important person is in this equation, there's actually several. You have to think in terms of this being a multi-point approach to getting the right people with the right skills, doing the right things in the fastest amount of time and the lowest level of investment. Everybody is interested in that. That's good for the CEO. HR would really support an approach like that. A person would love that clarity and love that speed, and a person's manager also gets right behind that idea. If those are the constituents or the stakeholders in the person's success, let's start to break it down. The reality is people are being underutilized. If you look at most engagement surveys, people say that they would like more of a challenge. About 1 out of every 2 managers is identified as someone who can actually lead and inspire an organization based on a recent poll done of CEOs. So let's think about that. So CEOs look at their management population and only have confidence in every other one. in terms of their ability to lead and inspire others. That's concerning. There's a big skill gap there. When you talk about leading the business globally, then they say 1 out of 3. So it actually gets a little further out. So only about a third of the managers, they have confidence in their ability to lead. If you take that from the employee perspective, only about 40% of employees actually have the confidence that their leaders have what it takes in order to lead the organization. And about the same number, 41%, when asked if they're being developed, only about 41% are saying yes, they're being developed. If you add all those things together, you have a huge opportunity for business disconnect, business crisis, not meeting the obligations that were set out. And the reality is it doesn't have to be this way at all. A couple of terms to put out there. Top performers are people who consistently deliver or over-deliver results. So when you hear the term top performers, there are people who reliably and over time deliver results. Top talent is referred to people who have the capability to go significantly further in scope and scale and complexity of responsibilities than they are today. And you're often considered top talent because you've demonstrated some really good results and you've demonstrated the capacity to have a bigger runway in front of you. As we break this down and think about talent management, I want you to think in terms of the full employee life cycle. So from recruiting to onboarding to workforce planning, all that piece to bring them into the organization. Then how you manage them, so the performance management piece, so setting performance expectations, providing good input on coaching and feedback, doing good performance reviews so people understand how well they did. Also on the development side. So is it a shorter term perspective, less than 12 months, or a longer term perspective, more of a career approach? Those are all elements that we're going to deal with. But if you take a step back and say, okay, what are the big ideas? What are the big buckets around talent management? There's really two. One is performance and one is development. Everything pretty much shapes out based on that. If you think the performance piece, the first thing we need to do is set good performance expectations. You wouldn't get in a car and have someone drive you someplace without giving them the destination or also giving them considerations along the way. You wouldn't do that. It'd be foolish. The reality is in a lot of organizations, that's exactly what's going on. That people are working against things that they don't have good clarity on. There's not good metrics to help determine whether they're successful or not. And it's confusing for the organization and it's confusing for the employee. Very frustrating. Along the way, we've got to check in. So the performance piece needs some type of calibration about how well people are doing. And then they need some good insight about whether they should course correct or do things differently. That's coaching and feedback. It should be iterative. It should not be formal unless there's some degree of formality required, but it should be conversational. It should be a dialogue. It should be something people gravitate towards, not away from. When someone finishes a performance cycle, how well did they do? I mean, the performance review process should be almost non-existent if you've done those other two pieces I mentioned first. And it should answer the question, how well did the person do what we said they were going to do? Did they do more or did they do less? There are a lot of inputs into this. So the person's own self-appraisal should be factored in. The manager's input should be considered. Any stakeholders, clients, partners, direct reports, they should also provide some input. When you make that determination, then how are you going to pay them? Because up front, you should have had a conversation about if you deliver these things, this is what you get financially in exchange. And so in order to uphold that, your financial, the money piece, the compensation piece should line up against that. In a nutshell, that's the performance piece. On the other side is the development piece. So as you think about the business strategy, the operational plan, what do you need in order to get this person to execute against it? Do they have what they need short-term and long-term in terms of experience and skills? And if not, what's your plan to solve for that? So development can have lots of inputs. You can have a 360 type assessment where all the people around the person has given them good input about what they can do to develop. You could have input against a job or role profile and do a gap analysis in terms of what's needed. You can also sit down with a manager and employee and have them have a conversation about what the gap is. You can look at succession plans. So succession plans are a longer term tracking of business strategy and capability needs, and then what your plan is to solve for that. So by looking at the succession plan, you can then translate that down into what the person should be working on as well. The development side has to be employee driven. When there's a match between employee interests and career interests, longer term with the organization, and the organization's needs and capabilities, succession planning, then you have an intersection. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way, and so sometimes people will decide to change jobs or leave an organization, etc. Transparency, candor, proactive conversations all help make this instructional and useful for both parties. In terms of where some of the confusion comes through, because at the end of the day, that's your performance management life cycle, you'll find that managers will say, I don't have the time to do that. Well, then we need to get those managers out of the job because they're spending time in ways that isn't necessarily contributing to the organizational success. We hear people say, I don't have the skills for that. That's very solvable, and we should get after it if it's a skill issue. In actuality, I take a step back when I don't get what I expect, and I hear people say, oh, I can't do it. And I find it's either a skill issue or a will issue. A lot of people aren't interested in assuming these responsibilities as managers. They were a very good functional expert, and as a result, they somehow got identified as a potential manager. They're very different skill sets. They are completely different skill sets. It's like on Friday you learn you can speak French, and being asked to speak Chinese on Monday. And one doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other. And so as we think about putting the right people in the jobs, we've got to think about that will issue, and do they have a desire to really make a difference in people's lives. On the employee side, part of that is the hiring process. So are you hiring for attitude? Are you hiring winners and athletes who can really reinvent themselves over time? People who have a high learning agility, a real interest in being part of a winning team. Those are profiles you want to bring into your organization. And then the rest of it is about giving them good purpose, good direction, good coaching, providing good feedback along the way. There are good systematic ways to look for whether this is working in your organization. You can do either short-term or annual engagement surveys to help determine whether this is working. Engagement surveys will help you directionally solve for big organizational issues or maybe local issues that are going on in a particular team. They also help you do temperature checks on culture. Culture is essentially a set of shared beliefs. Beliefs drive behavior. So when an organization has a set of beliefs that they hold true, that then dictates how people act. And it can be on the performance side, it can be how people interact in interpersonal relationships, it could be how you feel about diversity and the value of diversity and how diversity is managed. There's a lot of other good metrics you can use: turnover, promotability, retention, all things that indicate the health of your organization and the health of your culture. The trick is be clear on what you're trying to accomplish, then have clear indicators to tell you whether you're there, you're getting there, or you're not there, and then proactive plans to solve for it in the end. I have some guiding principles that I bring into every organization I work with around all of the talent management and talent development work. First of all is have a plan. What are you trying to accomplish? The second is link it to everything else. This idea of integrated approach to talent management is essential. A lot of times what happens in organizations is HR will drive things to try to help the business, but they're done in isolation. And so if you think about it from the employee's perspective or the manager's perspective, sometimes I call that death by 1,000 HR cuts. In reality, they keep having things come at them, but they haven't taken a big step back and thought about the totality of what we're trying to accomplish. Everything should be linked. Look at it, and here's another principle, but look at it through the eyes of the employee. They have one set of experiences. So if these things are coming at them, they have one development plan, right? That should be linked to one set of performance goals. The inputs should be integrated into the development plan, et cetera, et cetera. So an integrated approach to talent management in my world is essential. Also, think of employees as assets. They are often the biggest expenditure for organizations in terms of a line item on their balance sheet, and you want to think about how to grow that asset. So for example, with your 401k or your investment account, you wouldn't expect to see it to be the same amount at the end of the year as it was at the beginning of the year. Your employees are the same way. You need to think of them as assets and think about how you can grow that asset over a given set of time. A strategy I find helps work really well is put people into bigger roles ahead of when they're ready. That idea of being overwhelmed, that idea of wanting to be successful, that hunger for learning, it's most maximized when people are new to a role. And so you can get them to stretch quite a lot in those early days, particularly if you give them the right level of support, coaching, and feedback along the way. But most of the people that I have seen step into a role that's bigger than they are, they fight hard to be successful, and in the end, the organization benefits from it. And I can tell you, lots of different examples, time and time again around the world, where that's worked. But you got to make sure that you do a good assessment about their potential, and you have to make sure also that you're giving them good coaching and feedback. The other piece is this last idea that I just mentioned. The coaching and feedback is essential. If there's one thing I could change in all organizations, it would be to help people really develop good coaching skills, others to develop good skills to be coached, and then measure and hold people very accountable. Organizations who have transformational change, who consistently realize great results, they have in their DNA a high capacity to coach and be coached, and they understand the value of what that provides. So in terms of this concept of talent management, that's one of the biggest ideas. Thanks for taking the time to listen to some of my ideas on talent management. It's been proven in a number of organizations. The book, Demystifying Talent Management, is really powerful in terms of some of the simplicities of the concepts. And I implore you to be part of the solution going forward. Thanks so much. Take care.